Today I'm kind of nervous and kind of excited because this is the start of a brand new series on my channel. I'm going to be delving into the world of mystery, like conspiracy theory videos, things like that. I have been obsessed with watching these on YouTube for the longest time, like Bella Fiore, Kaylee Elise. I watch them all the time, obsessed with them. I've been really nervous about filming my own ones, and because I do beauty and lifestyle videos, it's very different from my regular genre, but I'm gonna delve into it. So if you do like this video or like the idea of it, please make sure you give this a thumbs up. It is really helpful for me to be able to gauge if people like this sort of video or not. And if you do really like it, click the subscribe button, because I think I'm going to aim to do one of these videos a week and one beauty video a week, so I'm excited. So I'm going to be starting off easy for myself, and I'm going to talk you through one of my favourite conspiracy, mystery, disappearance people of all time. This story is so crazy interesting. I've been intrigued by it for months. But it's basically the strange story of Dan Cooper. Now, on the afternoon of November 24th, 1971, a man walked up to the counter of the Northwest Orient Airlines in Portland International Airport and purchased a ticket to Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Now, this was a one-way ticket to Seattle-Tacoma. He bought a ticket for flight 305, and he identified himself as Dan Cooper. Now I think it's quite important to bear in mind that this was 1971, it was pre 9/11, airport security was nothing like it is now. It was very, very easy just to go up to a desk, purchase a flight for $20 and get on the plane. So Dan Cooper boarded the flight. He sat in seat 18C. He was wearing a dark raincoat, a dark suit, a white shirt. Sorry, I'm reading from my notes because I don't know how people do these videos. He had loafers, a black necktie and a mother of pearl tie pin. Now I'm only wearing one earring. So eyewitnesses on board described a man in his mid-40s, between 5'10" and 6 foot. From the sounds of it, there wasn't anything really different or intriguing about his appearance. It's probably just quite a normal looking guy who just got on a flight. Nobody really thought much of him. And this is where things get interesting. Shortly after takeoff, the man hands air hostess Florence Schaffner, I think that's how you pronounce it, a note. And now Florence just takes the note and throws it in the bin. This is when Dan Cooper leans over to her and says, "Miss, you should take a look at that note. I have a bomb." When she sits next to him, she asks to see the bomb, and he opens up his briefcase and she sees some red cylinders and some wires, and it probably looks like your stereotypical idea of what a bomb looks like. Now nobody really knows if this bomb was real or not. This is when he tells Florence his demands. He demands $200,000 in cash. He actually says in negotiable American currency, which is a weird way to say it. But he wants all in $20 bills. He wants 4 parachutes. He wants 2 back and 2 front parachutes, and he wants the money delivered in a knapsack. Oh, and he wanted a fuel truck on standby for when the plane arrived at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. So Florence goes up to the pilots, tells them his demands, and when she comes back, weirdly enough, the guy's sitting there in dark sunglasses. Now the idea of this just really tickles me, because obviously what's the point of him putting sunglasses on? Everyone's already seen him, they know what he looks like. Like, the air hostess has definitely got a good look at him by this point, so why now does he put on these sunglasses? Maybe he just like wants his Men in Black moment and he just wants to look cool whilst he's hijacking the airplane. So the pilot contacts the airport to tell the FBI and the police, obviously, because this guy's hijacking a plane. The plane sort of circles in the air for a couple of hours. All the passengers on board, I'm not sure if the passengers on board knew what was going on at this point. Can you imagine if they did know, like the hysteria on that plane? But the plane's just circling the airport for a couple of hours before it lands. Now, something interesting to bear in mind, which is very good when looking at suspects, is that the guy seemed to know a lot about planes. He knew a lot about the ground, so he was looking out the window and he commented to the air hostess, "Oh, that looks like Tacoma down there." And he also mentioned that the McCoy Air Force Base is about 20 minutes away, so clearly he knew the area very well. During this time, I think air piracy was quite an issue that airlines were struggling with. I definitely don't think this was just hijacking, like the only hijacking that had ever happened. I think air pirates had obviously a very scary stereotype. They were shouty and they were aggressive and they were angry, like as you'd expect a hijacker to be. Now, Dan Cooper was weird because he was very calm, very polite, very well mannered. He never like shouted or raised his voice. He just sat there. He was drinking bourbon and he was like chain smoking. He was incredibly calm. He even bought a drink for one of the air hostesses and paid for the drink and then told the air hostess to keep the change, which seems weird to me considering he was about to hijack a plane anyway. Like, while Dan Cooper's up in the sky chain smoking and drinking his bourbon, the FBI were on the ground gathering this £200,000 ransom money. They're taking note of every single serial number on every note, and they're making copies, like microfilm copies of each note. At 5:29 p.m, the plane lands at Seattle, Tacoma. The ransom was given. Cooper confirms he is happy with everything, and so the passengers and a lot of the air hostesses are allowed to leave. I think he lets Florence Schaffner leave. He just leaves one air hostess and the pilots, from what I've been able to gather. So whilst the plane's on the ground being refueled, Cooper is telling the cockpit crew what his plan is. He wants the plane to fly towards Mexico City. He wants the airplane wings to be at a certain angle. He wants the aft stairs, the stairs at the back of the plane, to be left down. The pilot actually says no, they cannot leave the stairs down because it's unsafe. Cooper says, actually no, it is safe. And the pilot still says no, that's not happening. So Cooper's like, fine, leave it up, I'll put it down myself. He also wants the plane to be at minimum speed, and he wants it to be at a very low altitude, obviously, because at this point he's planning to jump out of the plane. So Cooper wants to head southeast towards Mexico City, and the pilot says, we can do that, but the plane's range is actually only 1,000 miles. We'll need to stop off and refuel in Nevada. So at 7:40 p.m, the plane takes off and heads towards Reno, Nevada. There's only Cooper and 4 others on board, and 2 planes from the nearby Air Force Base are actually scrambled. One's flying above the plane and one's flying below the plane. So after I think they've been in the air for like 20 minutes, Cooper tells the remaining flight attendant, Alice Mucklow, to go join the pilot in the cockpit. Now as Alice walks away, she sees Cooper tie something around his waist. It's widely believed that what he was tying around his waist was the money, obviously. He ripped up one of the parachutes, so he had 4 parachutes, so he ripped up one of them to tie all the money around his waist and secure it to himself. So at 8 p.m, a warning light flashed up in the cockpit saying that the air stairs have been activated. Then shortly after, they notice a change in the cabin pressure, indicating that the door has been opened. Now, they don't leave the cockpit at all, they don't check. Only when they land in Reno, Nevada, I think a couple of hours later, I think at 10 o'clock, is it clear that Dan Cooper is no longer on board. So this is where the major FBI investigation takes place. Obviously, they sweep the entire airplane. They take, I think, 66 unidentified fingerprints. They find the black tie that Cooper was wearing, which was actually a clip-on, and they find the mother-of-pearl tie pin. There were 2 of the 4 parachutes left on board, so Cooper obviously took 1 front and 1 back parachute. One of the parachutes was all ripped up because that is what he used to tie the money onto himself. All the eyewitnesses were obviously interviewed. A composite sketch was made, or lots of composite sketches of the suspect was made, and they immediately began interviewing all these different suspects. Now, it was very difficult to precisely search where it was that they thought Dan Cooper jumped out of the plane. It could have been any time between 8 and 9 o'clock, they were saying, that Dan Cooper was most likely to have jumped out of the plane. Now, interestingly, Cooper didn't give the pilot specific route instructions. The pilot chose the route himself. So the pilot, because it was dark, it was a very dreary night, the conditions weren't that great, the pilot wasn't entirely sure where he was flying over. So he originally thought that he actually flew over sort of southwest Washington, over the Lewis River, Mount St. Helens sort of way. Also, interestingly, it was neither Air Force jet that was flying above and below the plane that saw Cooper exit at any point. This isn't actually that shocking, considering that it was very, very bad conditions. They could barely see in front of them. A man jumping out of a plane, in like perspective, is actually quite a small thing. He was wearing a dark suit. He could have easily jumped out undetected. The initial experimental reconstruction that was done showed that the most likely jump time was about 8:13 p.m. over the Lewis River in Washington. So the first search took largely around that area. They looked at the rivers, they looked at the base of Mount St. Helens, but obviously even in the original searches, nothing whatsoever was found. They were looking for discarded parachutes, they were looking for broken treetops, things like that. This was the most extensive and intensive search ever done in US history. It was a crazy big search. Only can you realise how pissed off they would have been when they realised quite a bit later that the likelihood is the plane didn't fly over that area at all. The flight actually flew a lot further east than originally suspected, so that entire search area was pretty much always going to come up with completely nothing. Turns out the most likely area that Cooper jumped over was the Washougal River in Washington. As you can imagine, there was a massive search for the money, and weirdly enough, none of the money was ever found. That was a lot of $20 notes that could have been put back into the system, but to this day, none of the serial numbers have ever been found, and not for lack of trying. The FBI put out searches in all the big banks, all like big money institutions, so casinos, big shops, things like that. Nothing was ever found. Eventually they actually released the serial numbers to the public, and still nothing was ever found. A lot of newspapers actually offered reward money for any of this money found, and none of it was ever found, which is crazy. Obviously a lot of it could have possibly slipped through the cracks. Like, can you imagine how time consuming it is for companies to search every single $20 bill they receive and check the serial numbers? It could have slipped through the cracks, but obviously if Dan Cooper did jump out and did survive and did spend the money, he probably wasn't stupid enough to do it so soon after jumping out. So this is where we move on to physical evidence, and they did actually manage to find quite a few bits of physical evidence. So in 1978, a placard was actually found about 13 miles east of Castle Rock in Washington. The placard had handwritten instructions on how to lower the aft stairs of a plane. So I think it's pretty safe to say that this was probably from the hijacker. So 2 years after that placard was found, in 1980, 8-year-old Brian Ingram actually was playing on a Tina Bar with his father. Tina Bar was a part of the Columbia River. It's just like a riverbed. And he uncovered a package, and inside the package was 3 packs of $20 bills. Now, all in all, I think it was £5,800, 2 full packs of bills, and in one pack, 10 of the bills had actually been taken out, which is weird. The FBI confirmed this was definitely part of the ransom. So much was looked into with these dollar bills, and it was eventually decided on that they had been taken downstream and then naturally buried in the riverbed. There was a lot of like speculation as to whether Dan Cooper had buried it himself, but from like the way that they had eroded and the sediments between the notes, a load of geographical stuff, they did decide that they had actually just flown down the riverbed and been buried naturally. The only thing they couldn't account for was where the 10 $20 bills had disappeared off to. So this did support the fact that Dan Cooper did land a lot further east than originally suspected, and it was most likely in the Washougal River. But to date, none of the other, I think it was like 9,000 something remaining bills have been found anywhere in the world. So skipping ahead 20 whole years now, the next piece of evidence wasn't actually uncovered until 2007. They finally managed to collect some DNA from the mother of pearl tie pin that was found on the plane. They didn't manage to connect the DNA to anyone, but the DNA was definitely found. From this, it sort of re-sparked the investigation a little bit, and the police released a load more information to the public. They released previously unseen composite sketches and fact sheets, and just appealed to the general public for any information whatsoever. And it was actually released to the public that one of the 4 parachutes that was given to Cooper was a dummy parachute. Now, the FBI didn't realise this when they picked it up. They just went to like a nearby skydiving school and picked up 4 parachutes and didn't even think to check them. But one of them was a dummy, meaning it was sewn shut and it wouldn't have opened. And this is actually one of the ones that Cooper chose to take with him. So clearly Cooper wasn't that much of an experienced skydiver. Like, to be able to pick a parachute that was a complete dummy that wouldn't have worked at all. If he was a really experienced skydiver, he would have seen that and wouldn't have chosen it, unless he was just really panicked, just picked up 2 and was like, these will do. And that also lends to the fact that maybe Dan Cooper didn't even make it to the ground. He might have died. So in November 2011, it was also announced that on the tie pin they had found some particles of pure unalloyed titanium. Now, although that is probably a lot more, like, you can find it a lot more around today, back in the late 60s, 70s, this would have been a very, very rare particle to find anywhere, which actually narrowed down the career path that Cooper could have been in. It is very, very, very likely that Cooper actually worked in metal production. And because of the fact it was a tie pin, suggests that he was most likely in this metal production facility, a manager or an engineer, somebody who wears fancy suits to work. So things we do know: Dan Cooper's physical appearance and all of the composite sketches are probably very, very, very close to what he actually looks like. There were countless eyewitnesses who all gave very similar sketches. He was familiar with the Seattle area, he was possibly an Air Force veteran. He was probably in a very desperate financial situation. And funny enough, they also managed to find out where his alias of Dan Cooper came from. It was actually from a very popular Belgian comic book at the time about Dan Cooper, who was an Air Force test pilot in Canada. And he basically did heroic things all the time, like jumping out of planes. And finally, on July 8th, 2016, the entire investigation was suspended. Now, even though the investigation has been suspended by the FBI, there is no statute of limitations on the crime that he has committed. If he was found today, he could be charged as if it was still the day after the hijacking. This is very serious. So although Dan Cooper has never been found, they have no idea who he is to this day. There are a lot of suspects. I've chosen out my favourite suspects, the ones that I think are most interesting, but these could all be totally wrong. Maybe it is one of these, who knows, but these are all interesting guys. So Theodore, or Ted Mayfield, is one of the first people the FBI actually considered, but they never really took the investigation into him very far. He was an Air Force veteran, he was a pilot, he was a competitive skydiver and instructor. He actually served time in 1994 for negligent homicide, and it turns out he was actually indirectly responsible for 13 skydiving deaths. He had a criminal record of armed robbery and, funnily enough, stolen aircraft transportation. So during the early investigation, apparently his name was brought up a lot as a possible suspect, according to Ralph Himmelsbach, I think, who is an FBI agent. He was actually ruled out on the fact that just a couple of hours after the plane landed in Reno, Nevada, he called Himmelsbach and offered his assistance and advice. Like, this is a possible alibi, but if Dan Cooper was a very, very smart man and he jumped out of the plane and he landed, he could have gone straight to a phone and called Himmelsbach and given him advice as a possible alibi. There was a book apparently written all about this, but the author died before it was published, so it was never actually released. I think he's an interesting suspect. Out of all of the suspects I'm going to mention, I don't think it is this guy, but he's definitely dodgy. Guys, you will not believe the day I've had, but I've just gone to edit this video to find out the last 10 minutes has completely corrupted and I can't access the footage at all. So I am refilming, that is dedication. But where I believe I left off was I was about to talk about our second suspect, Richard McCoy Jr. Now, Richard McCoy was an army veteran. He did 2 tours of Vietnam, one as a helicopter pirate and one as a demolitions expert. Now, as you would guess, after the 1971 hijacking, there was a lot of copycat hijackings, but the most successful one was done by Richard McCoy Jr. On April 7th, 1972, he boarded a United Airlines flight. He brandished a hand grenade, which was actually a paperweight, and a handgun which didn't have any bullets in. So he clearly wasn't intending to actually hurt anybody, but you know, the threat was there. Very, very similarly to Dan Cooper, he demanded a $500,000 ransom and 4 parachutes, which he got. Everything happened very, very similar to the Dan Cooper hijacking. Richard McCoy actually got caught. He was very clumsy. He left fingerprints on the magazine that he was reading on the plane. He had a criminal record. And he got caught just 2 days after the hijacking. Now, there's been a lot of suspicion over the years as to whether this hijacking went so well because he was Dan Cooper. Personally, I don't think he was at all. Richard never confirmed nor denied that it was him, but the FBI don't think it was him, and neither do I. Dan Cooper was so meticulous. He was like spot on with everything he did. He wouldn't be as careless as to leave fingerprints. There was actually an entire book written in 1991 about how McCoy is Dan Cooper. It was actually called Dan Cooper, The Real McCoy, and I just love that title because that is so punny. And it was actually written by a former parole officer and an FBI agent, obviously people who know a lot about the law and things like that. But it's been disproven by a lot of people. Richard McCoy actually escaped from jail, I think 2 years after he was incarcerated, and ended up being killed by police in a standoff. So even if it was him, then he is dead now anyway. Although a big thing that led a lot of people to say that McCoy was the hijacker was that the mother of pearl tie-pin that was found on the plane after the Dan Cooper hijacking, it was actually claimed by McCoy's family as being owned by McCoy, which I think is a lot of people's like leading hypothesis in this theory. Regardless, it's thought that McCoy actually had a pretty solid alibi for the time of the hijacking anyway. It's thought that he was in Las Vegas in Nevada during that time and then spent the next day, which is Thanksgiving, with his family. So unless he's very speedy, I don't see it being him. And now the next 2 suspects I'm going to mention are actually my favourite two. If I had to choose between these two, I don't think I could. I think they're both very, very solid theories. The first one was Dwayne Webber. Now Dwayne was a World War II veteran. He spent a lot of time in and out of jail during the 40s and 60s, doing for things like forgery and burglary and things like that. And it was actually on his deathbed. He died in 1995, and he told his wife to lean in, and he whispered to his wife, "I am Dan Cooper." Now at the time, the wife didn't think anything of it really. She was just like, oh, he's delirious, he's dying. And it wasn't until she mentioned the name Dan Cooper to a friend a few weeks later that the friend mentioned the hijacking. So his wife, I can't remember her name, I didn't write it down, but his wife went to the local library to do some research, and when she opened the books on Dan Cooper, she found writing all in the margins by Dwayne. It was in Dwayne's handwriting. So immediately she was a bit like, oh, that's weird. And then she started to recall a lot of things. Dwayne used to have a lot of nightmares, and in his nightmares he'd talk about things like, he'd like sleep talk, and he'd be talking about jumping out of planes. And she vividly remembers one nightmare where he talked about leaving fingerprints on the aft stairs, which she obviously remembered because that's a very weird thing to be having nightmares about. Dwayne also had a knee injury from jumping out of a plane. Now he told his wife this, and I don't think his wife ever really questioned him on it. But he was a World War II veteran, so obviously a lot of stuff that happened back then you didn't really question. A lot of it was just old war injuries. Dwayne also drank bourbon and chain smoked, and in 1979 he actually took a trip to Washington and walked down the Columbia River and to Tina Bar with his wife. Now we mentioned to his wife during this trip that it was a very sentimental trip for him, and it was only 4 months later after that that the 8-year-old boy found the money buried at Tina Bar. The FBI have completely disregarded Dwayne as a suspect though, because his fingerprints just didn't match anything found on the plane. And that was that for the FBI really. They never really looked into it after that. And finally we have Kenneth Christensen. Now this is a really, really interesting theory. It was actually in 2003, after Kenneth had died. His brother was watching a documentary on unsolved mysteries, and the unsolved mystery they were talking about was Dan Cooper and the hijacking. Now Lyle Christensen immediately noticed a lot of parallels between Dan Cooper and his brother. There was lots of, they drank bourbon, they smoked, but the main one being that Kenneth was actually a spitting image of the composite sketches drawn by the FBI. So Lyle saw this, immediately drew all these comparisons and tried to contact the FBI. He never actually managed to get through to the FBI. I don't know if they just fobbed him off or he just got lost in the system. I'm not really sure what happened there, but he never had any contact with the FBI. So his next thought was to go to a movie director. Now I can't remember what the movie director was called, but it was the woman who directed Sleepless in Seattle, and he contacted her and basically said, I've got a great idea for a movie, it's about my brother, like it's really weird, I want you to direct it. He never heard back from her either. I'm not sure how his mind went from FBI to movie director, but it did. And then after he never heard from the movie director, he went finally to a private investigator in New York who sort of took this story and blew it up. Now Kenneth enlisted in the army in 1944 and he worked as a paratrooper in the army, so he did a lot of parachuting. And once he left the army, he joined Northwest Orient Airlines as a mechanic. Then he went on to be a flight attendant with them, and then he was a purser with them. So he worked with Northwest Orient Airlines for most of his life. He was a very quiet man. He's not someone you'd necessarily pick out on the street. There's nothing really strange about him. So if he did work for Northwest Orient, there's a very strong chance he could have just gone by undetected. Now apparently it was a well-known fact that back in the day Northwest Orient Airlines didn't pay very much money. I think I read a source online that said Northwest paid like $241 a month, which made it very, very strange when Kenneth was able to purchase his own house in cash. I think I read that his house was like $14,000 or something, which he bought in cash. After Kenneth died, they found over $200,000 in his bank accounts, along with multiple gold coins in his house and a very, very valuable stamp collection. Also, when his family searched his house after his death, they found a folder filled with newspaper clippings about Northwest Orient Airlines. Now these newspaper clippings actually stopped just before 1971, and there were no clips after that at all, which is very weird considering that Kenneth actually continued to work for Northwest Orient well after 1971. Why would he suddenly stop making these newspaper clippings, especially when there's probably the biggest story about Northwest Orient that's ever going to be in any paper ever, the hijacking. You'd think that if he was that enthusiastic about collecting these newspaper clippings, he would want all these clippings in his house. That was going to be a big story, unless of course it was him that did it and he didn't want to draw any attention to himself. Whilst Kenneth was dying of cancer as well, he did tell his brother Lyle that there is something he wanted to tell him, but he can't, and his brother never really pushed it because Kenneth was dying and it didn't really matter, they just wanted to spend their final days together. But that was suspicious in itself. However, the FBI have completely disregarded Kenneth as a suspect, because even though Florence Schaffer, one of the flight attendants on the flight, said that Kenneth is probably the closest looking to Dan Cooper she's ever seen. She said she can't 100% confirm it was him, but it definitely looked a lot like him. The FBI have said that Kenneth was too short and too skinny, and that was the end of that pretty much. I'm going to go because this lighting is getting worse by the minute. I can't believe my memory card corrupted and I lost all that. First time I filmed it was so much better, guys, I promise. Anyway, I'm going to go now. If you enjoyed this, please make sure you give it a thumbs up. Tell me if you liked it, please, and give me ideas for any other mysteries that you want me to talk about. I do want to do a lot more like disappearances, murderers, things like that. But I wanted to start less murdery, less creepy. Just a bit of a weird one, this one. I'm gonna go. Mwah. Bye.